My younger sister ignored my entire existence for 9 years, unless she needed a scapegoat. At our annual Christmas dinner, she loudly mocked my worthless little shipping app and asked what I planned to do with my life. I calmly took a sip of my wine and told her I just sold it for $167 million. Her jaw hit the floor. The entire dining room went dead silent. But the real shock came when my mother revealed exactly what she had done behind my back. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Atlanta meant our family was obsessed with image. My father, David, is a prominent cardiologist who values prestigious titles above everything else. My mother, Brenda, is a high-profile socialite deeply entrenched in elite circles. To them, I was always the odd one out. I am Rochelle, a 34-year-old unmarried woman who spent the last decade quietly running a logistics software company I built entirely from scratch. My younger sister, Sydney, was the ultimate golden child. She is 26 years old, married to a slick finance guy named Trent, and completely dependent on our parents for her lavish lifestyle. Trent is white and works in finance, but his firm is subsidized by my father. Trent always condescended to me, treating my tech career like a cute little hobby that would eventually fail. The Christmas dinner was suffocatingly warm. The dining room was packed with extended family members eating collard greens and prime rib. Aunt Loretta sat near the head of the table, observing everyone with her usual gossipy stare. Trent sat directly across from me, swirling an expensive glass of aged scotch. He always spoke to me like I was a completely helpless child. He smirked and asked how my little shipping project was doing. He said the tech market is tough for amateurs and offered to review my books for a small consulting fee. Sydney giggled loudly, making sure the entire table was listening. She told everyone that I should just let Trent handle my finances before my worthless little business went bankrupt. I looked around the large mahogany table, expecting someone to defend me. No one did. My father just picked up his napkin and wiped his mouth. My mother was busy fixing her perfect hair, refusing to make eye contact with me because she enjoyed watching Trent put me in my place. I took a deep breath and set my fork down very carefully on my plate. I told Trent I appreciated his concern, but my little shipping project was actually doing just fine. Sydney rolled her eyes loudly and asked how fine it could really be, since I was still driving the same basic 4-year-old car every single day. I kept my voice perfectly level and told her I sold my company last week for $167 million. The silence in the room was absolute and heavy. You could hear a pin drop. My father froze with his wine glass halfway to his mouth. Trent let out a loud, condescending laugh and said there was absolutely no way my company was worth a fraction of that amount. He demanded proof, claiming I was just trying to steal attention from Sydney on a major holiday. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and opened my secure banking application. I slid the phone across the smooth table, right until it stopped perfectly in front of Trent. He picked it up with a smug grin that vanished the second his eyes registered the numbers. He stared at the pending wire transfer from a major holding company. The exact figure was right there in bold black text. His face turned completely ghost white. He slid the phone to my father, who put on his reading glasses and gasped out loud. Suddenly, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted completely. The aggressive disbelief instantly morphed into an even more aggressive entitlement. My father stood up and walked over to me with a wide, artificial smile. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder and announced to the room that this was a true blessing for the family. He told everyone that Trent had been facing some very rough patches with his hedge fund lately, and my sudden windfall was the exact miracle they needed to secure the family legacy. Sydney immediately clapped her hands together and said they could finally upgrade her house in Buckhead. They were already spending my money in their heads without even asking. My mother started talking about throwing a massive country club gala to introduce me to her high society friends so she could show off her brilliant firstborn daughter. I slowly looked at the people who had treated me like an absolute failure my entire life. I took a slow, deep breath and told my father no. I told him I would never be giving Trent a single dime to bail out his failing business. I told Sydney she would have to pay for her own upgrades because my hard-earned wealth was absolutely not her personal piggy bank to break open. The smiles dropped instantly. The sudden warmth evaporated, leaving nothing but a cold and furious resentment. My father raised his voice, demanding respect. He told me that family shares everything and I owed them for raising me. I reminded him that he cut off my college tuition the day I changed my major to computer science. I worked overnight shifts at a diner to pay for my degree, while he bought Sydney a luxury car for passing. My mother slammed her crystal wine glass down onto the table so hard the delicate stem nearly snapped. She glared at me with pure venom in her eyes. She told me to stop being a brat because I did not have a choice anyway. I felt a strange chill run down my spine, and I asked her exactly what she meant by that. She sneered and proudly announced that I had to pay Trent because she had already put my company down as collateral for his bridge loan last year. I just stared at her, completely stunned. She had forged my signature on bank documents. The ultimate betrayal was staring me in the face as my family smirked. I sat perfectly still, letting my mother's words hang in the heavy dining room air. The scent of roasted prime rib and expensive perfumes suddenly felt suffocating. Brenda took a slow, delicate sip of her wine, acting as if she had just confessed to borrowing a sweater rather than committing a major federal crime. She waved her manicured hand in the air, a gesture of pure dismissal. She told me to stop looking at her like she had committed murder. It was just a signature, she said. She explained that Trent needed immediate liquidity for his hedge fund and the bank required a secondary guarantor. Since she assumed my little shipping company was virtually worthless, she figured no one would ever bother to audit the paperwork. It was meant to be a temporary bridge loan to keep Trent afloat until his investments rebounded. Except his investments never rebounded. The market shifted, his high-risk bets failed, and the bank came knocking for their $4 million. Trent shifted uncomfortably in his chair, pulling at the collar of his tailored shirt. His usual arrogant swagger was beginning to crack, revealing the desperate man beneath the expensive suit. He tried to force a laugh, a nervous, hollow sound that echoed terribly in the silent room. He told me it was just a temporary cash flow issue and that I was overreacting. He insisted that now that I had $167 million in the bank, I could simply clear the balance and keep the family reputation spotless. He actually had the audacity to call it a minor administrative error. Sydney slammed her hand down on the table, rattling the crystal water glasses. Her face was flushed with anger, but not at her husband or her mother for committing fraud. She was angry at me. She pointed an accusing finger across the table and screamed that I owed them this money. She said I was being a selfish, ungrateful brat. She yelled that our parents gave me life, put a roof over my head, and paid for my upbringing, so the absolute least I could do was protect her husband from a minor banking misunderstanding. She demanded that I write the check tomorrow morning and stop trying to ruin her Christmas. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I looked directly into Sydney's furious eyes and asked her exactly what I owed our parents for. I asked her if I owed them for the college tuition my father abruptly stopped paying the very day I told him I was switching my major from pre-medicine to computer science. I reminded them how my father told me I was a foolish embarrassment and cut off my bank accounts, leaving me completely stranded at 19 years old. I looked at my mother and reminded her of the overnight shifts I worked at a 24-hour diner on Peachtree Street just to afford my textbooks and rent. I reminded them how I would come home smelling like industrial bleach and stale coffee, exhausted to my bones, while they happily leased Sydney a brand new Mercedes-Benz as a reward for maintaining a completely average grade point average in her basic communications classes. I told Sydney she had never worked a hard day in her entire life, and the only thing I owed this family was the exact amount of support they gave me when I was starving, which was absolutely nothing. My father David finally found his voice. His face was a mask of furious authority. He stood up from his chair, demanding that I lower my voice in his house. He told me I was acting completely out of line and that we would handle this situation as a family. He said I would pay the $4 million to clear Trent's debt because a scandal of this magnitude would destroy his medical practice and their standing in the Atlanta country club scene. He said I had more than enough money now, and it was my duty to protect the family name. I did not panic. I did not flinch. I slowly reached down into my designer leather tote bag resting beside my chair. The room watched me in total silence as I pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. I dropped it onto the center of the mahogany dining table. It landed with a loud, definitive thud. I looked at my mother and told her I already knew all about the forgery. I explained that when a major conglomerate acquires a tech company for over $100 million, they do not just hand over a check. They send in teams of forensic accountants and corporate auditors to scrutinize every single financial record spanning back to the very creation of the business. I told her my legal team caught the fraudulent lien 6 months ago during the preliminary acquisition audit. Brenda's face lost all its color. Her perfect posture finally crumbled as she stared at the thick envelope on the table. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. I continued speaking in a calm, measured tone. I told them the bank had flagged the signature as fraudulent and was actively preparing to turn the case over to the authorities for federal wire fraud and identity theft. I told my mother she was facing serious prison time. I watched Trent swallow hard, a bead of sweat slowly rolling down his temple. He tried to put on a brave face and told me that since I was sitting here calmly, it obviously meant I had paid off the bank to save them. He actually smiled and thanked me for being a team player. I looked at Trent and let a cold smile touch my lips. I told him he misunderstood the situation completely. I explained that I did not report my mother to the police, and I absolutely did not pay off his debt. Instead, I had my corporate attorneys negotiate directly with the lending institution. I used a fraction of my early acquisition capital to purchase the distressed debt from the bank. The realization hit Trent like a physical blow. He sank back into his chair completely paralyzed. I told them that they no longer owed the bank $4 million. They owed me. I was now their sole creditor. Every single document, every fraudulent signature, every defaulted payment schedule was now my personal property. My father sank slowly back into his chair, his eyes fixed in horror on the legal dossier resting on the table. He asked me what I meant by being their creditor. His voice was barely a whisper, stripped of all its previous arrogant authority. I turned my gaze to my father and delivered the final blow. I asked him if he knew what Brenda had put up as secondary collateral when Trent began missing his high-interest payments. I asked him if he had noticed any strange appraisers taking photos of the property a few months ago. David turned to look at his wife, his expression transforming into pure, unadulterated panic. Brenda refused to look at him, staring instead at her hands trembling in her lap. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. I told them my mother did not just risk my company. When the bank demanded more security to keep the loan afloat, she quietly leveraged the equity of the family estate. I tapped the thick envelope with my index finger. I told them I bought the debt, which means I now hold the lien on the collateral. You do not just owe me $4 million plus compounding interest. I own your debt, and because of that, I now effectively own this entire house. The silence in the dining room shattered the moment the reality of my words settled over the table. My father David stood up so fast, his heavy dining chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. His face was a dark mottled purple. He slammed both of his fists onto the mahogany table, sending the crystal wine glasses trembling. He pointed a shaking finger at my face, and his voice echoed through the high ceilings. He told me I was a disgrace to the family name and a ruthless opportunist. He swore that if I dared to foreclose on his estate, he would personally ensure that my reputation in Atlanta was completely destroyed. He threatened to call every country club, every charity board, and every medical professional in his vast network to blackball me. He said by tomorrow morning I would be a social pariah and my new corporate partners would deeply regret associating with a toxic, vindictive daughter. I sat perfectly still. I did not flinch or break eye contact. I calmly reached for my water glass and took a slow sip. I told my father that my corporate partners only cared about logistics algorithms and quarterly profits, not country club gossip. Seeing that my father's intimidation tactics were completely failing, Trent abruptly changed his strategy. He pushed his chair back and stood up. His slick, charming finance brother persona completely melted away, revealing the arrogant predator underneath. He leaned over the table, glaring at me with cold, calculating eyes. He told me I was not nearly as smart as I thought I was. He said that a massive corporate buyout does not make me untouchable. Then he delivered his legal threat. Trent proudly reminded the table of a Thanksgiving dinner exactly 5 years ago. He claimed that during a brief conversation over appetizers, he had given me the foundational advice for my logistics routing software. He stated that his offhand comments about supply chain optimization constituted verbal business consulting. Because of that brief, unsolicited holiday conversation, Trent declared himself a shadow co-founder of my tech company. He crossed his arms and confidently demanded a 20% founder's fee from my $167 million buyout. I let out a single sharp laugh. The sheer audacity of a man trying to claim 20% of my life's work based on a 5-minute conversation about delivery trucks was almost admirable in its delusion. I told Trent he was absolutely out of his mind, and that no judge in the state of Georgia would ever entertain such a ridiculous claim. Trent just smirked. He told me his hedge fund had an entire floor of aggressive corporate litigators on retainer who specialized in bleeding tech founders dry through endless frivolous lawsuits. He warned me that by the time his lawyers were finished dragging me through discovery, I would gladly hand over the 20% just to make the headache go away. He told me to enjoy my wealth while I still had access to it. I left the house shortly after leaving the heavy manila envelope on their table. I slept incredibly well that night in my penthouse. The next morning, the Atlanta sun streamed through my floor-to-ceiling windows. I woke up early, feeling completely unbothered by Trent's empty threats. I made myself a cup of black coffee and opened my laptop at my kitchen island. I had planned to start my morning by finalizing a $200,000 philanthropic donation to a local scholarship fund for young women in engineering. I logged into my secure personal banking portal to authorize the transfer. Instead of the usual confirmation screen, a bright red error message flashed across my laptop display. The text stated that my primary domestic accounts were currently locked. I frowned and refreshed the page, thinking it was a simple network glitch. The red error message remained. A moment later, an automated email from my wealth management bank arrived in my inbox. The subject line indicated an emergency legal hold. I opened the email and read the attached documents. Trent had actually done it. He did not wait a single day. He had his legal team file a massive injunction in civil court, claiming intellectual property theft and breach of oral contract. He petitioned a judge to freeze my liquid assets, pending a full investigation into his claim that he was a foundational investor in my company. The sheer speed of the filing meant he had likely been preparing this ambush the moment he heard rumors of my company selling. He slapped a temporary freeze on my domestic accounts, hoping to panic me into an immediate settlement. I did not panic. I did not shed a single tear of frustration. I did not throw my coffee mug against the wall. Panic is a luxury for people who do not have a strategy. I simply closed my laptop, finished my coffee, and walked into my closet. I selected a sharp, tailored charcoal suit. I called my private driver and told him to bring the car around immediately. 45 minutes later, I stepped out of the elevator and into the sleek glass-enclosed reception area of my corporate attorney. Valerie is a sharp veteran of corporate warfare. She is a brilliant older woman who has spent decades dismantling arrogant men in boardrooms across the country. She was already waiting for me in her corner office with the injunction paperwork printed and spread across her massive glass desk. Valerie did not offer small talk. She pointed to a specific paragraph highlighted in yellow ink. She told me Trent's injunction was bold but incredibly reckless. According to the legal filing, Trent was no longer just claiming he gave me verbal advice over a turkey dinner. He escalated his lie to a federal level. The document stated that Trent provided $50,000 in seed money to me 5 years ago through an anonymous shell company to fund my early server hosting costs. He submitted this claim to cement his status as an early equity investor. I sat down in the leather chair across from Valerie. I told her firmly that I never took a single dime from Trent or anyone else in my family. I explained that my early seed money came from a random anonymous angel investor grant I won through an online tech incubator forum. I never knew the true identity of the donor, but it legally funded my initial server costs. Valerie leaned back in her chair and smiled a slow, lethal smile. She turned her computer monitor so I could see the screen. She had pulled up the specific routing numbers and transaction histories Trent submitted to the judge as absolute proof of his early investment in my company. Valerie told me that Trent was arrogant enough to submit real bank routing numbers to the court to make his fake investment look legitimate. But Valerie's forensic accounting team had already run a trace on those exact routing numbers. She looked me dead in the eye and revealed the fatal flaw in his master plan. She explained that the routing numbers did not belong to Trent's hedge fund or any legitimate investment vehicle. The money he claimed to have given me came from a highly illegal and deeply compromised source. Trent had just submitted a completely fraudulent paper trail to a federal judge, believing his wealth and status would prevent anyone from actually verifying the origin of the funds. He thought he was trapping me, but he had just handed us the exact weapon we needed to destroy his entire financial empire. Valerie tapped her manicured fingernail against the heavy glass desk. She pulled up the next set of financial records on her massive computer monitor. Trent had been incredibly sloppy. He was so used to operating under the protective umbrella of my father's reputation that he never bothered to cover his tracks with any real sophistication. Valerie explained that the $50,000 he claimed to have given me 5 years ago did not come from a venture capital fund or a personal savings account. She had her forensic team run a deep trace on the exact routing numbers he proudly submitted to the federal judge. The money bounced through two anonymous shell corporations before leading directly back to a very familiar domestic account. It was a nonprofit organization. Specifically, it was the Atlanta Heritage Youth Foundation. I sat perfectly still as the name echoed in Valerie's quiet office. My mother, Brenda, had been the executive chairwoman of that exact foundation for the last 8 years. It was her crowning social achievement. She hosted their annual galas, wore their charitable work like a badge of honor, and used the foundation to cement her status among the city's absolute elite, and Trent was draining it dry. Valerie handed me a thick stack of printed wire transfers. She told me Trent had not just stolen the $50,000 he tried to pin on me. For the past 3 years, he had been siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars from the charity to float his failing hedge fund and subsidize the lavish lifestyle he shared with my sister. The luxury cars, the designer bags, the private trips to the Maldives, they were all paid for by money meant for underprivileged youth programs. Trent was literally stealing from the very community my parents claimed to uplift, and he was doing it using my mother's foundation as his personal piggy bank. I thanked Valerie, gathered the documents, and walked straight to the elevator. I did not need to call my mother to know where she was. It was a Tuesday afternoon, which meant Brenda was holding court at her exclusive country club in Buckhead. The drive to the club took less than 20 minutes. The valet rushed to open my door as I stepped out of the car, carrying nothing but my leather tote bag and the undeniable proof of my family's complete moral bankruptcy. I walked through the heavy oak doors and bypassed the reception desk. I found my mother exactly where I expected her to be. She was sitting in the private sunroom overlooking the manicured golf course, sipping a mimosa with 3 other wealthy socialites. She was wearing a pristine white tennis outfit, laughing brightly at a joke someone had just made. Her laughter died the second she saw me approaching her table. She quickly excused herself, telling her friends she needed a moment to speak with her estranged daughter. She pulled me into a secluded corner of the lounge, away from the prying eyes and eager ears of her high society circle. She crossed her arms and glared at me. She asked what I was doing there and warned me not to make a scene in front of her important friends. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of the disgust boiling inside my chest. I simply reached into my bag and pulled out the stack of printed wire transfers. I handed them to her and suggested she look very closely at the highlighted account numbers. Brenda snatched the papers from my hand. She glanced at the first page, then the second. I watched her face, expecting to see shock. I expected her to gasp or turn pale or show some sign of absolute horror that her precious son-in-law was embezzling from her prized charity. I expected her to be furious that Trent was jeopardizing her pristine social standing and risking serious federal prison time for both of them. She did not gasp. She did not look horrified at all. Instead, she calmly folded the papers in half and slipped them into her designer tennis bag. She looked me dead in the eye with a terrifying, chilling indifference. She told me to lower my voice and stop acting like a dramatic child. I stared at her, completely stunned. I asked her if she understood what I had just handed her. I told her Trent was stealing massive amounts of money from her charity and using it to buy Sydney designer shoes and luxury vacations. I told her this was massive federal fraud. My mother took a slow sip of her mimosa. Her voice was cold and perfectly steady. She told me I knew absolutely nothing about how the real world operated. She said that Trent was going through a temporary dry spell with his investments, and the family had to step up to provide him with basic liquidity. I asked her why she would risk her own freedom and reputation to fund a man who was clearly a massive financial fraud. Brenda stepped closer to me, her eyes narrowing with intense calculation. She spoke in a low, harsh whisper so her friends across the room would not hear. She told me that Trent was a white man working in high-level finance in the South. She explained that having him in our family provided them with immense cross-cultural leverage. She said his presence opened doors in certain corporate spaces that my father could never access on his own. She told me Trent gave the family a very specific kind of power, and because of that, they took care of him. She actually justified stealing from a youth charity because Trent made their family look more prestigious to wealthy white investors. She looked at me with pure disdain and told me that this was the cost of maintaining power, and I was simply too small-minded to ever understand it. She warned me to keep my mouth shut about the charity money. She said if I breathed a word of this to anyone, she would personally see to it that I was entirely cut out of Atlanta society. She told me to go back to my empty penthouse and leave the complicated family business to the adults. I was about to tell her that I did not need her society or her permission to destroy Trent when the heavy glass doors of the sunroom suddenly burst open. Every single head in the quiet country club lounge turned at the sudden violent noise. Sydney came storming through the doors. She looked like an absolute wreck. Her hair was completely disheveled, her designer clothes were rumpled, and tears were streaming down her face in thick, heavy rivers. She was hyperventilating, gasping for air, as if she could barely breathe. She ran straight toward our corner of the room, clutching her stomach with both hands. She was sobbing hysterically, making sure her voice carried loudly enough for every wealthy socialite in the room to hear her clearly. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face and screamed at the top of her lungs. She wailed that I was a monster. She cried out to the entire room that my relentless greed and my toxic jealousy were literally destroying her life. She collapsed against our mother's shoulder, sobbing uncontrollably as Brenda wrapped her arms around her, performing the role of the fiercely protective mother for her captive audience. Sydney looked at me with tears pouring down her cheeks and screamed that the massive stress I was putting on her husband with my fake corporate bullying was causing her severe medical complications. She gripped her stomach tighter and cried out that I was making her lose her baby. The entire lounge fell into an absolute deathly hush as Sydney collapsed into a velvet armchair, weeping loudly and clutching her stomach. The wealthy women, who had been sipping mimosas and discussing charity galas, now stared at me with pure horror. Brenda immediately dropped to her knees beside Sydney, stroking her hair and glaring up at me like I was a monster. My mother loudly called for a glass of water and told everyone in the room that her poor pregnant daughter was being relentlessly targeted by her own sister. Sydney wailed that the stress of my baseless legal attacks against Trent was causing her physical agony, and she was terrified for the life of her unborn child. The performance was flawless. The Atlanta socialites whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between my distraught sister and me, standing there with my leather tote bag. I did not defend myself. I knew exactly how this crowd operated, and any attempt to explain the wire fraud or the fake injunction would only make me look like the jealous, unhinged woman Sydney was portraying. I simply turned around and walked out of the country club, leaving them to their theatrical display. By the next morning, the rumors had spread through the elite circles of Atlanta like wildfire. Sydney had completely weaponized her supposed high-risk pregnancy. She painted a tragic picture of a devoted, expecting mother whose greedy tech billionaire sister was trying to bankrupt her innocent husband out of pure spite. My phone was flooded with text messages from extended family members and old acquaintances telling me how disappointed they were in my behavior. They accused me of putting corporate greed above the life of an unborn child. Sydney was soaking up the sympathy, posting vague emotional updates on social media about the importance of protecting her peace and her baby during a time of horrific family betrayal. She had successfully positioned herself as the ultimate victim, and Trent as the stressed father desperately trying to shield his growing family from my cruelty. The emotional blackmail reached its peak 2 days later when my father David called my private cell phone. He did not ask how I was doing or inquire about the fraudulent injunction Trent had filed against me. His voice was cold, hard, and full of righteous fury. He told me that Sydney had been put on strict bed rest due to severe complications from the stress I was causing. He demanded that I immediately unfreeze my assets, drop my legal defense, and pay Trent whatever he needed to make the problem disappear. He said that if I caused his daughter to suffer a miscarriage, my name would be permanently erased from the family, and he would make sure everyone in Atlanta knew I was responsible. He told me I had a chance to save my future nephew, and if I had a single shred of humanity left in my cold heart, I would do the right thing and surrender to Trent's demands. I sat in my office and listened to my father use a supposed unborn child as a bargaining chip to cover up massive federal wire fraud. I did not raise my voice or try to reason with him. I calmly told him that medical emergencies do not negate the fact that Trent embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from a youth charity. My father shouted that I was a heartless disgrace and slammed the phone down. Any normal person might have felt a twinge of guilt or doubt, but I knew my sister. I knew Sydney better than anyone else in that family. She was a master of evasion and manipulation. Whenever she backed her expensive cars into a mailbox, she claimed the brakes malfunctioned. Whenever she failed a class, she claimed the professor was biased. Now that her husband was facing federal prison time and the loss of his entire social standing, she suddenly manifested a high-risk pregnancy that required everyone to immediately drop their demands. The timing was entirely too perfect. I knew I needed absolute concrete proof before I could confront a room full of people about a fake baby. I reached out to Valerie, my corporate attorney, and asked her for a recommendation. Within an hour, she connected me with a highly discreet private investigator named Marcus, who specialized in delicate, high-stakes family disputes. I met Marcus in a quiet coffee shop and handed him a file containing all of Sydney's recent social media posts, her listed doctors, and the specific details of my father's medical clinic. Since David was a prominent cardiologist, he had extensive connections across the Atlanta medical network, and Sydney claimed she was receiving specialized care from one of his top colleagues. I hired Marcus to look into her daily routine, her spending habits, and any verifying details about this miraculous pregnancy. Marcus went to work immediately. For an entire week, he tracked Sydney's movements. He observed her leaving the house not for medical appointments or strict bed rest, but for discreet shopping trips and private lunches at upscale boutiques. He noticed she was drinking full glasses of wine at secluded patio tables and ordering sushi platters that expecting mothers are strictly advised to avoid. But the observational evidence was not enough to dismantle her lie completely. I needed the undeniable truth. Marcus utilized his extensive network of contacts to quietly probe the medical facility where Sydney supposedly received her high-risk maternal care. He did not break the law or hack into private servers, but he knew how to verify patient registries and admission logs. 3 days later, Marcus called me and asked me to meet him at Valerie's office. When I arrived, Marcus was laying out a series of photographs and digital logs on the conference table. He looked up at me and shook his head. He told me that Sydney was absolutely not pregnant. There were no obstetrician appointments, no ultrasound records, and no high-risk maternal care being provided by my father's colleagues. She had not stepped foot inside a maternal health clinic in her entire life. It was a complete and utter fabrication designed to force me into submission. But Marcus had discovered something even more explosive during his investigation. He found the actual reason why Sydney chose a fake pregnancy as her ultimate shield. He pulled out a copy of a massive family trust fund document that David had established decades ago. The trust contained millions of dollars wrapped up in generational wealth meant to secure the family legacy. Marcus pointed to a specific clause buried deep within the legal text. The entire trust fund was designed to remain locked and inaccessible to anyone until a very specific condition was met. The trust would immediately pay out a massive multi-million-dollar lump sum upon the confirmed birth of David's first biological grandchild. Sydney was not just faking a pregnancy to guilt me into dropping the fraud charges against Trent. She and Trent were drowning in massive debt, facing the total collapse of his hedge fund, and terrified of the authorities closing in on the charity embezzlement. They were faking the pregnancy to rapidly trigger the payout of the family trust fund. They planned to use the millions from the grandbaby clause to secretly replace the stolen charity money and pay off the bank before the federal auditors completely destroyed their lives. The fake baby was their million-dollar escape plan. I now had the absolute proof that my sister was orchestrating a massive biological con to rob our father's trust fund. Armed with this knowledge, I knew Trent would be running out of time. Since his wife could not actually produce a magical baby overnight to pay off his massive fraudulent debts, he was backed into a corner. The federal auditors were breathing down his neck, and the charity embezzlement was a ticking time bomb. He needed raw cash, and he needed it immediately. I knew exactly what a desperate, arrogant man would do next. He would bypass me entirely and go straight to the source of my wealth. Trent booked a first-class flight to New York City. He planned to march directly into the corporate headquarters of the massive conglomerate that had just acquired my logistics company. His strategy was both incredibly reckless and deeply predictable. He intended to bypass my legal team and extort the acquiring company directly. He was going to present his fabricated documents and claim that I had committed massive corporate espionage. He planned to tell them that my entire routing algorithm was stolen from his hedge fund's proprietary software. He was betting that a massive publicly traded conglomerate would rather write him a quiet settlement check for $20 million than risk a highly publicized intellectual property scandal that could tank their stock price. He thought he was a brilliant shark swimming in open waters. He had absolutely no idea he was swimming straight into a trap I had set days ago. My corporate attorney Valerie had sources everywhere. The moment Trent's assistant booked his flight to New York, Valerie's network flagged it. We knew exactly which building he was heading to and exactly who he was demanding to see. I did not try to stop him. I told Valerie to let him walk right through the front doors. Then I boarded my own private flight to Manhattan. The New York headquarters of the conglomerate was a towering fortress of glass and steel in the financial district. I arrived 2 hours before Trent's scheduled meeting. I took the private executive elevator up to the top floor and walked into the massive corner boardroom. The room featured a polished marble table and floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the entire Manhattan skyline. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and took a seat at the far end of the long table. Valerie sat next to me, opening her leather briefcase and laying out our counter evidence. We waited in perfect silence. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy wooden doors of the boardroom swung open. Trent walked in, carrying a thick leather briefcase and wearing his most expensive custom-tailored suit. He had slicked his hair back and pasted on his signature arrogant finance brother smile. He expected to walk into a room full of panicked corporate executives desperate to protect their newly acquired asset. He expected to command the room and dictate his terms. Instead, he stopped dead in his tracks the moment his eyes landed on me. His confident swagger evaporated instantly. He stared at me sitting calmly at the end of the table with my coffee mug. His face twisted into a mask of pure fury and confusion. He demanded to know what I was doing there. He yelled that he was there for a highly confidential meeting with the chief executive officer of the conglomerate, and that my presence was a massive conflict of interest. He told me I was about to lose everything because he had absolute proof that I stole my entire company from him. I did not raise my voice. I took a slow sip of my coffee and gestured to the empty leather chair across from me. I told him to take a seat and present his case. I explained that as the founder and lead developer of the acquired asset, I had every right to be present while he attempted to extort my parent company. Trent sneered and threw his briefcase onto the marble table. He unzipped it aggressively and pulled out stacks of fabricated technical documents and fake non-disclosure agreements. He loudly declared that the conglomerate was legally exposed and that he was prepared to file a federal lawsuit unless they paid him a $20 million settlement by the end of the business day. He was so busy grandstanding and yelling about his fake evidence that he did not hear the boardroom doors open a second time. He did not hear the sharp, confident click of designer heels walking across the hardwood floor. He was right in the middle of threatening to destroy my entire career when a woman spoke from behind him. Her voice was perfectly calm, but held the sharp, lethal edge of absolute authority. She asked Trent if he really thought a $20 million extortion attempt was the smartest move for a man already facing federal wire fraud. Trent spun around, ready to yell at whatever executive had just interrupted his performance. But the words died in his throat the absolute second he saw her face. The blood completely drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a ghost in an expensive suit. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping into the heavy marble table. The woman standing at the head of the boardroom was named Victoria. She was the brilliant, ruthless chief executive officer of the entire global conglomerate. She was also the woman who had personally approved the $167 million acquisition of my company. But to Trent, she was someone else entirely. I watched Victoria's eyes lock onto Trent with the cold precision of a predator who had finally cornered her prey. She slowly walked toward him, her gaze never leaving his face. She reminded him of a top-tier investment firm on Wall Street exactly 7 years ago. She reminded him how he used to corner her in the copy room and make highly inappropriate comments about her body. She reminded him how she had reported his sexual harassment to human resources. And she reminded him how he had used his wealthy family connections to bury her complaint and have her fired and blacklisted from her department just to cover up his own disgusting behavior. Trent was physically shaking. He opened his mouth but could only let out a pathetic, stammering noise. Victoria smiled a slow, terrifying smile. She told him that getting fired from that firm was the best thing that ever happened to her. She said it motivated her to build her own empire from the ground up until she became the chief executive of a conglomerate that could buy and sell his miserable little hedge fund 10 times over. She leaned in close to Trent and delivered her final verdict. She told him she was sending all of his fraudulent extortion documents straight to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Then she promised him that she was going to use every single connection she had to permanently blacklist his name from every financial institution on the Eastern Seaboard and ensure he never worked in finance again. The news of Trent's absolute destruction in New York reached Atlanta before his return flight even landed. Victoria had kept her word, and within hours Trent's name was effectively radioactive across the entire financial sector. When he finally arrived back at the Buckhead estate, he was a completely broken man, stripped of all his arrogant bravado. But my family did not respond to his catastrophic failure with humility or self-reflection. Instead, they chose to escalate the war to an entirely new level. Brenda and Sydney realized that their legal threats and fake medical emergencies had failed to secure my money, so they decided to destroy me in the court of public opinion. They were enraged and utterly humiliated by my refusal to bow to their demands. They needed a new weapon to force my hand, and they found it in a popular, highly influential Atlanta gossip blog known for destroying reputations and ending careers. 2 days later, my phone began vibrating endlessly with notifications from people I had not spoken to in years. My mother and sister had given an exclusive anonymous interview to the blog, but the highly specific details made it entirely obvious who they were talking about. They spun a tragic, infuriating sob story designed to completely assassinate my character in the public eye. Sydney played the role of the heartbroken pregnant sister who was facing imminent homelessness because her ruthless billionaire sibling refused to share the wealth. Brenda added her own toxic spin, claiming that I had turned my back on my own community the second I became wealthy. They painted a picture of a greedy tech founder who sold out her black family for corporate white money and abandoned the very people who supported her rise to the top. The blog post described me as a cold, calculating traitor who cared more about protecting her massive fortune than saving her unborn niece or nephew from living on the streets. The public backlash was immediate and incredibly intense. People who had never even met me suddenly had strong, aggressive opinions about my moral character. Former classmates, distant relatives, and local business leaders shared the article across social media, adding their own disgusted commentary. They called me a sellout, a disgrace, and a perfect example of how money corrupts the soul. My father David silently approved of the smear campaign from the sidelines, hoping the immense social pressure would finally force me to crack. He thought that public shame would break me down and force me to hand over the millions Trent needed to survive. They genuinely believed I would be terrified of losing my standing in Atlanta society. They thought I would issue a public apology and pay the extortion money just to make the nightmare stop and restore my public image. They were entirely wrong about me. I sat in my penthouse overlooking the city and read the vicious comments with absolute indifference. I did not issue a public statement or hire a public relations firm to mitigate the damage. I did not defend myself on social media or beg for their understanding. I knew that engaging with a cheap gossip blog was completely beneath me and utterly useless against people who were committed to misunderstanding me. I let them have their petty social victory because I was about to initiate a counterstrike that would dismantle their entire reality. I opened my encrypted laptop and contacted Valerie. I told her it was time to deploy the final phase of our defensive strategy. We had spent weeks compiling undeniable proof of Trent's massive financial crimes, and we were not going to share it with a local blog. We went straight to the top of the global financial media. I anonymously leaked a meticulously redacted financial dossier to a senior investigative journalist at the Wall Street Journal. The report we provided was a masterpiece of forensic accounting. It did not explicitly name Trent or his specific hedge fund, but the operational details were incredibly precise and impossible to ignore. The dossier exposed a massive unnamed Ponzi scheme operating right out of the heart of Atlanta. It detailed how the fund was using new investor capital to artificially inflate returns and quietly siphoning money from local nonprofit organizations to keep the entire operation afloat. The business model outlined in the leaked documents matched Trent's exact operation with terrifying precision. It showed how millions of dollars were being systematically erased through anonymous shell companies and offshore accounts, while the fund managers lived lives of absurd luxury. The Wall Street Journal published the explosive exposé early on a Thursday morning. It sent a massive shockwave through the entire financial industry across the country. Even though Trent's name was redacted, the specific geographic markers and operational details were more than enough to trigger absolute panic among his high-net-worth investors. Within hours of the publication, Trent's phone lines were completely jammed with wealthy clients demanding immediate withdrawals of their capital. The entire foundation of his fraudulent empire began to violently collapse under the weight of the journalists' intense scrutiny. Brenda and Sydney were too busy checking their social media likes on their pathetic gossip post to realize that the ground beneath their feet had just completely vanished. The true devastation hit exactly 24 hours later. The Securities and Exchange Commission does not ignore front-page exposes in major financial publications. On Friday morning, the federal government announced an immediate unannounced audit of several regional hedge funds, matching the description in the article. Trent's firm was at the very top of their list. A team of federal agents walked right into his high-rise office building and seized every computer server, hard drive, and physical ledger they could find. They locked down his accounts and began a massive forensic sweep of his entire business history. The game was completely over. I was quietly sipping tea in my kitchen when my private line rang. It was my father. The arrogant entitlement and furious demands he had displayed just days ago were completely gone. David sounded like a man who was watching his entire life burn to the ground in real time. His voice was shaking with raw, unrestrained panic as he struggled to breathe. He told me that federal agents were currently tearing through Trent's office, and he was terrified that the charity accounts were going to be audited next. He abandoned all of his pride and frantically pleaded for my help. He begged me to immediately wire them a $10 million bailout to cover the missing charity funds before the government investigators found the bottom of the rabbit hole and sent his son-in-law and his wife to federal prison. I listened to the sound of my father's ragged breathing through the phone speaker. He was practically hyperventilating as the federal agents tore apart Trent's office. He begged me for the $10 million again, his voice cracking with a pathetic kind of desperation I had never heard from him before. I sat perfectly still in my penthouse and asked him a very simple question. I asked him why he needed exactly $10 million and how Trent's massive financial failures had anything to do with my personal bank accounts. My father fell silent for a long, heavy moment. The arrogant patriarch who had ruled our family with an iron fist for decades was completely gone. In his place was a terrified old man who had finally run out of options and out of lies. He tried to stammer out an excuse, but I cut him off immediately. I told him I already knew about the grandbaby clause hidden deep inside the family trust. I told him I knew Sydney was faking her entire pregnancy to trigger the multi-million-dollar payout so they could quietly replace the stolen charity funds before the government found out. I told him their million-dollar escape plan was already dead. David let out a broken sob that sounded like a wounded animal. He realized I knew too much and he finally stopped lying. He told me the situation was actually much worse than I realized. He confessed that Trent's hedge fund had been bleeding money for years. Long before the charity embezzlement even started, Trent had come to him begging for a massive cash injection to cover his early catastrophic losses on the stock market. David admitted that he did not have the liquid cash to save his son-in-law at the time. All of his vast wealth was tied up in the generational family trust. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach as I listened to him speak. I knew the rules of that trust inside and out. It was established by my grandfather decades ago with incredibly strict parameters. The money was heavily protected and legally earmarked only for direct blood descendants. It was supposed to be a secure financial foundation for my future children and Sydney's future children. There was absolutely no legal way for my father to pull millions of dollars out of that specific trust to bail out a failing son-in-law. I asked him exactly how he managed to bypass my grandfather's ironclad legal stipulations. My father took a shaky breath. He told me that family protects family at all costs. He said he did the only thing he could do to save Trent's reputation and maintain our prestigious standing in the elite circles of Atlanta society. He admitted that 5 years ago he went to a private judge and legally adopted Trent as his own son. The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I stopped breathing for a second. I stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his betrayal. My father had literally signed away my birthright. He had given away the generational wealth meant for my future children to a white son-in-law who was actively defrauding people. He adopted a grown man in secret just to grant him executive access to our family legacy. He did it all because Trent gave him access to exclusive country clubs and wealthy white investors. He traded his own daughter's future for a pathetic facade of societal power and cross-cultural leverage. I asked him to say it out loud. I demanded that he admit he stole from his own blood to fund a criminal. David started crying and pleading into the receiver. He told me I did not understand the immense pressure he was under to keep the family image intact. He said Trent was family now, and we had to protect him from the federal government. He confessed that Trent had not just taken a few million to cover his early losses. As a legal son and a newly minted trustee, Trent had secretly tied the entire generational trust to his hedge fund as collateral. David sobbed into the phone and told me that if the Securities and Exchange Commission seized Trent's assets today, they would take the entire family trust with them. Everything my grandfather built would be gone by sunset. He begged me to wire the $10 million to create a firewall and save our family legacy from federal seizure. He told me it was my duty as a loyal daughter to fix this massive disaster. I did not scream, I did not cry. I sat in my quiet office and I laughed. It was a cold, chilling sound that echoed in the empty room. My father stopped crying and asked me what was so funny. He demanded to know if I was actually enjoying watching my own family lose everything they had ever built. I told him I was absolutely enjoying it. Then I reminded him about the massive commercial loan he took out 2 years ago. I reminded him how he desperately wanted to expand his private medical clinic to keep up with his wealthy peers. He had borrowed heavily against his own personal assets, but his patient numbers had dropped, and he started missing his loan payments. I reminded him how he had bragged to our entire family when a mysterious anonymous holding company swooped in and bought his debt from the bank, giving him a temporary extension. David asked me what his clinic debt had to do with Trent's federal raid. I told him that I was the anonymous holding company. I told him I used my tech fortune to quietly purchase every single cent of his personal debt 2 years ago. I owned him completely. I heard him gasp through the phone, but I did not let him speak. I calmly explained the fine print of my grandfather's trust documents. I told him I had my corporate attorneys read every single page of the original charter. The trust included a very specific protective clause designed to prevent reckless trustees from destroying the family wealth. If the primary trustee ever defaulted on massive personal debt, the executive voting rights of the trust would automatically transfer to the debt holder to protect the remaining assets. I told my father that because I owned his defaulted debt, I had legally executed that exact clause 48 hours ago. I explained that I was now the sole executive trustee of the Generational Family Trust. He and Trent no longer had any legal authority over a single dime. I told him that my very first action as the new executive trustee was to completely sever the trust from Trent's failing hedge fund. I had fully liquidated Trent's access and moved every single asset into a secure locked account under my exclusive control. My father started screaming my name. He realized that the federal agents tearing apart Trent's office would find absolutely nothing to seize from our family. He realized the trust was perfectly safe, but it was entirely out of his reach. He realized that Trent was completely exposed to the federal government with no family money left to save him. I told my father that his fake white son was going to federal prison and he was going down with him. I told him to enjoy the country club and I hung up the phone. The silence in my office was incredibly peaceful after I hung up the phone. I knew my father was likely tearing his study apart in a blind panic, but that was no longer my problem. I had successfully severed Trent's access to the family wealth and secured my grandfather's legacy. For the next 3 days, my phone rang constantly. I ignored every single call from my parents and my sister. I knew they were scrambling. The federal investigation into Trent's hedge fund was escalating rapidly, and without my money, they had absolutely no way to pay for the elite defense attorneys they so desperately needed. They were drowning, and they knew I was the only person left holding a life raft. On the 4th day, I received a completely different kind of message. It was a formal summons to the main family estate in Buckhead. The message was sent by my mother's assistant, claiming there was a critical family emergency that required my immediate presence. They framed it as a time for necessary healing and spiritual guidance. I knew exactly what that meant. They were out of legal maneuvers and financial threats, so they were pivoting to emotional warfare. I decided to attend. I put on a tailored suit, grabbed my leather tote bag, and drove to the estate one final time. The gate swung open to reveal the sprawling manicured lawns and the massive brick mansion my parents had used to project their absolute superiority over everyone else. I parked my car and walked through the heavy front doors. The housekeeper directed me toward the formal living room. When I crossed the threshold, I found my entire family waiting for me. David was sitting in a high-backed leather chair looking exhausted and 10 years older. Brenda sat next to him, clutching a tissue and wearing an expression of practiced sorrow. Sydney was curled up on a velvet sofa, resting her head on Trent's shoulder. Trent looked pale and completely broken, but they were not alone. Sitting directly across from them was Pastor Evans. He was the head of the massive mega church my parents attended. He was a man who specialized in catering to wealthy donors and twisting scripture to justify their extravagant lifestyles. My parents had called in their ultimate moral authority to publicly shame me into submission. I walked into the room and took a single empty chair opposite the pastor. I did not greet my family. I simply crossed my legs and waited. Pastor Evans leaned forward with a soft, condescending smile. He clasped his hands together and began his carefully rehearsed sermon. He spoke in a low, soothing voice about the sacred bond of family and the ultimate power of forgiveness. He looked at me with deep faux concern and told me that holding on to anger was poisoning my soul. He said that God blesses those who show grace in times of profound hardship. I sat perfectly still and let him talk. He went on to explain that my father and my sister were suffering immensely. He pointed to Trent and said that good men sometimes make mistakes under the crushing weight of providing for their families. He told me that my tech fortune was a blessing that should be shared to protect the family name and ensure the safety of Sydney's unborn child. He actually sat there and used a fake pregnancy to guilt me into funding a federal criminal. He finished his pathetic performance by telling me it was my spiritual duty to pay my tithe to the family by releasing the trust funds and paying off Trent's debts. He said that true redemption required financial sacrifice. My mother let out a soft, calculated sob. My father looked at me with pleading, desperate eyes. They truly believed this ridiculous theatrical intervention would break me down. They thought the heavy religious guilt would make me forget the years of emotional abuse, the blatant theft, and the fact that my father had legally replaced me with a white fraudster. I waited until the room was completely silent. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of the fury burning inside my chest. I unclasped my leather tote bag and reached inside. I pulled out a thick, certified legal folder. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the pristine marble coffee table echoed loudly in the quiet room. I placed my hand flat on top of the document and pushed it directly across the table toward my father. David stared at the folder like it was a live explosive. He slowly reached out and opened the cover. I watched his eyes scan the first page. I watched the remaining color completely drain from his face. His hands started shaking so violently that the papers rattled against the marble. Pastor Evans looked confused and asked what was wrong. My mother leaned over to look at the document and let out a genuine horrified gasp. I looked at the pastor and calmly explained exactly what I had just delivered. I told him that when I anonymously purchased my father's defaulted medical clinic debt 2 years ago, I did not just acquire the clinic and the executive voting rights to the family trust. I explained that my father was so arrogant and so desperate for cash that he had secured that massive commercial loan using the family estate as collateral. He had literally bet the roof over their heads on his failing business. I told the room that because he had officially defaulted on the loan and failed to make his payments, I had legally initiated foreclosure proceedings. I explained that the document sitting on their coffee table was not a negotiation or a plea for reconciliation. It was a certified 30-day eviction notice. Trent buried his face in his hands. Sydney let out a piercing, hysterical scream and buried her face in her mother's shoulder, forgetting entirely about her fake pregnancy complications. Brenda looked at me with pure, unadulterated terror. She realized that she was about to lose the one thing she valued above all else. She was losing the physical symbol of her elite social standing. The mansion she used to rule Atlanta society now belonged entirely to the daughter she had spent decades tearing down. I stood up from my chair and smoothed the front of my suit. I looked down at my father, who was staring blankly at the eviction notice, completely paralyzed by the realization that his empire was entirely gone. I told them they had exactly until the end of the month to pack up their designer clothes and vacate my property. I turned my attention to the pastor who was sitting there in stunned, absolute silence. I gave him a cold, polite smile. I told him that since he was so deeply committed to charity and helping families in their time of need, he might want to help them find a shelter. Then I turned around and walked out the front door. I walked out the front door of the estate and stepped into the crisp morning air, leaving the heavy silence of the formal living room far behind me. I did not look back at the grand brick facade or the perfectly manicured lawn that my parents prized so highly. I knew my mother was likely weeping into the pastor's shoulder, and my father was staring at the legal notice that officially ended his reign of terror. I got into my car and drove back to the city, feeling a profound sense of weightlessness. The toxic chains of familial obligation and financial extortion had been completely and legally severed. But I knew my sister well enough to know that she would not surrender her lavish lifestyle without one final dramatic performance. Sydney had spent her entire life having her mistakes magically erased by our parents, and she simply could not comprehend that my bank accounts were permanently closed to her. She needed a new target for her rage, and the very next morning she decided to bring that rage directly to my doorstep. I was in the middle of a critical quarterly strategy meeting when my executive assistant quietly entered the boardroom. She leaned down and whispered that my sister was currently causing a massive security incident in the main lobby of our corporate headquarters. Sydney had bypassed the visitor checkpoint and was screaming at the front desk staff, demanding immediate access to my private office. I calmly excused myself from the meeting and took the private elevator down to the ground floor. When the polished doors opened, I found Sydney pacing the marble lobby looking absolutely deranged. Her designer handbag was slung carelessly over her shoulder, and her face was flushed with frantic, unrestrained anger. The moment she saw me, she marched forward, pointing her finger and demanding a private buyout right there in front of my employees. She shouted that I was a ruthless monster for trying to make a pregnant woman homeless. She demanded a $5 million settlement to walk away and promised she would never bother me again if I just wrote the check. She was bargaining like a desperate cornered animal, completely oblivious to the fact that she had absolutely no leverage left and that her fake pregnancy meant nothing to me. I stood there calmly watching her unravel in front of my staff and the building security team who were waiting for my signal to intervene. I did not raise my voice or offer her any sympathy. I simply let her exhaust herself in a public tantrum that proved exactly how entitled and out of touch she really was. I was just about to instruct the guards to escort her off the premises when a sharp, repetitive chiming sound cut through her hysterical demands. Sydney's phone was vibrating violently in her hand. Then it started ringing relentlessly. Then a massive flood of rapid-fire notification sounds began echoing through the quiet corporate lobby. She paused her frantic rant to glance down at the screen. I watched her expression shift from aggressive entitlement to complete absolute horror. The color vanished from her face, leaving her looking pale and sick. She dropped her expensive designer bag onto the marble floor and started frantically scrolling through her messages, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the device. The federal audit of Trent's hedge fund had not remained a quiet government investigation. Someone inside the agency, or perhaps an eager financial reporter, had just leaked the preliminary findings of Trent's corporate expense accounts to the national press. The forensic accountants had discovered exactly where a massive portion of the missing charity funds and investor capital had gone. Trent had not just been embezzling money to cover his terrible stock market trades and prop up his failing business. The leaked audit revealed a secondary set of hidden books detailing years of luxury expenses, including a multi-million-dollar penthouse condo leased under a quiet shell company. He had been using the stolen money to fund an extravagant secret life for his mistress. The articles flooding Sydney's phone included undeniable financial paper trails and photographs linking Trent to his 22-year-old white secretary. He had been buying her imported sports cars, diamond jewelry, and first-class tropical vacations, while Sydney was busy playing the role of the perfect high society wife in Atlanta. The ultimate betrayal was laid bare for the entire world to see. Sydney looked up at me with tears spilling over her eyelashes. The sheer humiliation of being publicly exposed as a cheated-on wife was entirely destroying her carefully crafted reality. All of her arrogant pride and her demanding entitlement evaporated in an instant. She turned and ran out of the lobby, pushing past the security guards and leaving her expensive bag sitting on the floor. I knew exactly where she was going. She was heading straight back to the Buckhead estate to seek the protection and righteous fury of our parents. She fully expected David and Brenda to absolutely destroy Trent for humiliating their golden child in front of the entire city. She expected them to throw him out onto the street and hire the most vicious divorce attorneys in the state to tear his life apart. She wanted them to defend her honor, just like they always had. But later that evening, my private investigator sent me a transcript of the events that actually unfolded at the estate. When Sydney arrived screaming and crying about the mistress, she did not receive the furious defense she anticipated. My mother did not condemn Trent or demand that he immediately leave the house. Instead, Brenda pulled her sobbing, heartbroken daughter into the formal dining room and shut the heavy wooden doors. Brenda looked Sydney right in the eyes and delivered a chilling piece of advice that perfectly summarized our family's toxic foundation. She told Sydney to dry her tears, fix her makeup, and completely ignore the affair. She told her golden daughter that pride and dignity were luxuries they could no longer afford in their current financial state. She instructed Sydney to swallow her public humiliation and stand by her man until the federal dust settled and the hidden offshore money was fully secured. My mother made it absolutely clear that keeping the illusion of wealth and securing the remaining stolen funds was far more important than her own daughter's self-respect. She told Sydney that all powerful men have secrets, and that a smart wife knows exactly when to look the other way for the sake of the family empire. It was the ultimate betrayal from a mother to a daughter, proving once and for all that in our family money would always matter more than morality. Sydney sat in the formal dining room of the Buckhead estate, completely paralyzed by her mother's horrific advice. For her entire life, Sydney had been the undisputed golden child of the family. She was the beautiful, compliant daughter who followed all the rules, married the right kind of man, and provided our parents with the perfect social cover. She genuinely believed that David and Brenda loved her unconditionally. But as she stared into Brenda's cold, calculating eyes, she finally realized the terrifying truth. They did not love her at all. They loved the access and the prestige that Trent provided. They loved the image of a wealthy white son-in-law more than they loved their own flesh and blood. Sydney was nothing but a pawn in their obsessive game of social climbing and financial preservation. The realization hit Sydney with the force of a freight train. She was facing the absolute destruction of her marriage, her public reputation, and her financial security. She was expecting her mother to wrap her in a warm embrace and promise to protect her from the humiliation. Instead, her mother was ordering her to go back to a man who was stealing millions and spending it on a 22-year-old secretary. Brenda was commanding her to smile for the cameras and pretend everything was fine just so they could salvage a few $1 million before the federal government seized it all. For the very first time in her 30 years of life, Sydney experienced a tiny fraction of the profound abandonment and emotional starvation I had endured for my entire existence. The safety net she always thought she had simply did not exist. Sydney did not argue with Brenda. The fight completely drained out of her body. She stood up from the heavy mahogany table and walked out of the dining room without saying a single word. She went up to her childhood bedroom and threw a few basic necessities into a small overnight bag. She walked past my father, who was still frantically pacing the hallway, shouting into his cell phone at various defense attorneys who were repeatedly refusing to take his calls. David did not even look at her as she walked down the grand staircase and out the front door. Sydney got into her luxury car and sat behind the steering wheel completely numb. She had absolutely nowhere to go. All of her high society friends were already texting each other screenshots of Trent's leaked financial audits. They were vicious gossips who would pretend to comfort her while secretly mocking her massive downfall behind her back. She drove around the city for hours, aimlessly navigating the dark streets of Atlanta as her entire reality collapsed around her. She had no money of her own. Her personal bank accounts were entirely tied to Trent's corporate assets, which the federal government had already frozen pending their criminal investigation. She was stripped of her arrogant bravado and her cruel entitlement. She was just a broken, terrified woman who desperately needed a safe place to hide from the brutal world. Late that evening, the concierge of my residential high-rise called my private line. He informed me that my sister was standing in the empty lobby asking to see me. She was not demanding access or threatening the security staff this time. The concierge said she was quietly crying and politely asking if I was awake. I authorized him to send her up to the top floor. I stood in the center of my penthouse living room and watched the heavy metal elevator doors slide open. Sydney looked like an absolute ghost. Her expensive designer clothes were wrinkled, and her face was deeply stained with ruined makeup. She stepped into my apartment, clutching her small duffel bag like a life preserver. The aggressive, dominating woman who had stormed into my corporate lobby just hours ago demanding $5 million was completely gone. She looked around my pristine, quiet home with exhausted, defeated eyes. She did not ask for a massive corporate buyout. She did not threaten to ruin my reputation or bring up the fake medical emergencies she had used to try and extort me. She simply dropped her bag on the hardwood floor and broke down into genuine, agonizing sobs. She told me everything Brenda had said in the dining room. She recounted the horrific coldness of our mother's demands. She wept as she admitted that our parents cared more about Trent's stolen money than her personal dignity. She looked at me with raw, absolute desperation and asked if she could just sleep in my guest room for a few days. She begged for a safe place to figure out her next steps, far away from the relentless media reporters, the federal agents, and the toxic manipulation of our parents. I stood there and watched my sister cry in the middle of my living room. I felt a brief, fleeting moment of pity for her because I knew exactly how agonizing it felt to realize your own parents viewed you as a disposable financial transaction. I knew the exact shape of that particular family heartbreak. But pity is not the same thing as forgiveness, and shared trauma does not erase a lifetime of calculated, malicious cruelty. I walked over to my kitchen island and poured myself a glass of cold water. I let her cry until her heavy sobs reduced to quiet, ragged hiccups. Then I looked at her and spoke with absolute, unshakable calm. I told Sydney that I understood how much she was hurting right now. I validated her pain and agreed that what Brenda did to her was incredibly cruel and unforgivable. But then I reminded her of everything she had deliberately done to me over the last decade. I reminded her how she used to mock my small studio apartment when I was working 80-hour weeks to build my tech company from the ground up. I reminded her how she laughed when our parents cut me off financially and told everyone my business was a pathetic, useless hobby. I reminded her how she actively participated in making me the family scapegoat just to secure her own comfortable position as the golden child. I did not stop there. I reminded her that just a few days ago she had gone to a gossip blog and painted me as a greedy monster who wanted her fake unborn child to be homeless. She had happily tried to destroy my entire life and my public reputation just to get her hands on my money. She had stood by and watched me drown for years because it benefited her social standing, and now she wanted me to save her from the exact people she had always protected. Sydney stared at me with wide, terrified eyes as the harsh realization finally set in. She opened her mouth to stutter out an apology, but I held up my hand to stop her. I walked over to the console table near the front door and opened the top drawer. I told her that she did not get to mock my life and my business for a decade, and then come crawling back to sleep on my expensive silk sheets the second her fake reality came crashing down. I walked back over to where she was standing and held out my hand. I handed her 2 crisp $100 bills and a small plastic prepaid gift card. I looked her directly in the eyes and told her, "Here is $200 and an Uber gift card." I reminded her that this was the exact same thing she and my mother had given me years ago when they kicked me out of my college apartment to make room for Trent's new home office. I told her to use the money to find a cheap motel and figure out her own life. I pointed toward the open elevator doors and told her she was no longer welcome in my home. The heavy metal elevator doors slid shut, cutting off my sister's panicked sobbing and leaving my penthouse in absolute silence. I walked back to my desk and sat down, feeling a profound sense of closure. Sydney was finally experiencing the exact same abandonment she had watched my parents inflict on me for over a decade. But the dismantling of my toxic family was not quite finished. My father, David, still believed he could salvage his professional reputation and walk away from Trent's catastrophic downfall relatively unscathed. He thought that because I had legally severed the family trust from the hedge fund, he was somehow immune to the federal investigation. He was completely wrong. The Securities and Exchange Commission did not stop their forensic audit at Trent's downtown office building. The federal agents followed every single wire transfer and offshore routing number directly to their final destinations. It did not take long for them to notice a massive, glaring anomaly in the financial records. Millions of dollars of stolen investor capital had been quietly funneled right into the payroll and operational accounts of David's private medical clinic. Trent had been systematically laundering his embezzled money through my father's prestigious medical practice for years. When the federal agents arrived at the clinic unannounced, David went into a state of absolute blind panic. He immediately reverted to his favorite survival tactic, which was blaming everyone else for his own failures. He stood in the middle of his lavish waiting room and confidently lied to the federal investigators. He claimed he had absolutely no idea where the sudden influx of cash had come from. He tried to pin the entire massive money laundering operation on his loyal office administrators. He pointed his finger at the innocent working-class women who managed his front desk, claiming they must have been secretly conspiring with Trent behind his back. He was perfectly willing to send his own innocent employees to federal prison just to save his own skin. David genuinely thought he was smart enough to outsmart the federal government. He thought that because he had ordered his IT department to wipe the clinic servers and delete his private email accounts the night before the raid, there would be no paper trail linking him to the dirty money. He completely forgot who his daughter was. He forgot that I built a multi-billion-dollar technology empire entirely from the ground up. I did not even need to hire outside contractors to expose his lies. I simply utilized my own corporate tech logistics network. I assigned my top cybersecurity team to quietly investigate the digital footprint of my father's medical practice. It took my engineers less than 48 hours to completely bypass his cheap amateur firewalls and recover every single deleted file from his hidden servers. They pulled thousands of emails, direct messages, and digital financial ledgers that David thought were permanently erased. The recovered documents were an absolute masterpiece of wealthy arrogance and blatant corruption. The emails completely destroyed his pathetic attempt to blame his office staff. My engineers found dozens of digitally signed authorizations proving that David knowingly and willingly accepted Trent's dirty money. He personally approved the fake invoices and the inflated payroll records to wash the stolen funds. But the most sickening part of the discovery was reading exactly why he did it. The recovered emails proved that David was fully aware the money was stolen, but he happily accepted it anyway, just so he could afford to pay his exorbitant luxury country club dues. He actively participated in a federal money laundering scheme simply to keep his expensive yachts, his luxury cars, and his elite social status intact. He traded his integrity and his medical oath for country club dinners and golf tournament invitations. He was so terrified of looking poor in front of his wealthy white friends that he willingly became a criminal to maintain the illusion. I sat in my office reading through the recovered emails and felt a deep, hollow disgust for the man who was supposed to be my father. He was not a respected medical professional or a pillar of the Atlanta community. He was just a greedy, pathetic parasite who fed off the success and the suffering of others. I knew exactly what needed to be done. I did not call him to gloat, and I did not demand an apology. He was completely incapable of feeling genuine remorse anyway. Instead, I had my legal team compile every single recovered email, every signed fake invoice, and every digital timestamp into one massive, undeniable dossier. I did not send the files to the local gossip blogs, and I did not send them to the federal agents because I knew the government would eventually find the truth on their own. I went straight for the one thing my father valued even more than his country club membership. I went for his identity. I anonymously submitted the entire unredacted digital dossier directly to the State Medical Board of Georgia. I knew the medical board moved much faster than the federal court system, especially when presented with undeniable proof of massive financial corruption and felony money laundering. They do not take kindly to doctors who use their medical licenses to run criminal enterprises and exploit their own staff. The very next morning, David was sitting in his half-packed mansion, desperately trying to figure out how to avoid the upcoming foreclosure eviction. The doorbell rang, and a courier handed him a thick, certified envelope. It was not from the bank, and it was not from Trent's lawyers. It was an official disciplinary notice from the state medical board. I was not there to see his face when he opened it, but my private investigator sent me the details later that afternoon. The letter informed David that due to the overwhelming severity of the financial evidence recently brought to their attention, his medical license was suspended indefinitely, pending a full federal investigation. He was legally barred from practicing medicine or stepping foot inside his own clinic ever again. His entire career, his prestigious reputation, and his primary source of income were completely eradicated with a single anonymous email. The great patriarch of the family was now just an unemployed, disgraced criminal waiting for the federal government to arrive and take him away. But my quiet victory was interrupted the very next morning by a frantic phone call from my lead financial investigator. The federal dragnet was tightening around Trent, and he was reacting exactly like the desperate cornered rat I always knew he was. He had caught wind of the upcoming sealed indictments and realized that his offshore accounts were completely frozen. He needed liquid cash immediately to flee the country before the government seized his physical assets and revoked his travel privileges. Trent had quietly reached out to a notorious vulture capital firm based out of Chicago. They were famous in the financial underworld for acquiring highly distressed assets and failing hedge funds for pennies on the dollar with absolutely no questions asked. Trent was offering them total control of his remaining corporate structure, including the physical office building and the remaining client lists, in exchange for a quick, quiet cash buyout. He was planning to take the money, grab his emergency go-bag, and board a private charter flight to a country with no extradition treaty to the United States. He truly believed he had found the perfect loophole to escape the consequences of his actions. What Trent did not know was that the vulture capital firm he was desperately begging for a lifeline was no longer an independent entity. As soon as my investigator alerted me to Trent's escape plan, I immediately contacted my wealth management team. I took a fraction of my $167 million fortune and initiated an aggressive overnight hostile takeover of that exact capital firm. The sheer speed of the acquisition was a testament to the absolute power of liquid capital. I authorized the purchase while sipping my morning coffee, watching the digital transfer clear, before my assistant even finished briefing me on the details. It was almost poetic that the same tech fortune my family had endlessly mocked was now the exact instrument used to dismantle their final escape route. Trent had spent weeks negotiating this lifeline, completely unaware that I was reading every single one of his desperate emails and reviewing every single term sheet he submitted. I owned the firm he was begging for mercy from, and by extension, I owned his future. The closing meeting was scheduled for 3 o'clock on a rainy Thursday afternoon. We arranged to hold it in a sterile, glass-walled conference room at a neutral corporate law office downtown. I arrived 2 hours early and instructed the legal team on exactly how this performance was going to play out. I wanted Trent to feel the absolute certainty of his escape right up until the very last second. I took my seat at the head of the massive mahogany table in a high-backed black leather executive chair, and I turned it completely around to face the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the pouring rain. I heard the heavy wooden doors open precisely at 3. I could hear the frantic scuffling of Trent's expensive leather shoes against the polished floor. He was breathing heavily, practically panting with anxious anticipation. My lead attorney greeted him and directed him to the seat directly opposite my turned chair. Trent did not even bother to ask who was sitting there. He was too consumed by his own survival instinct to care about the identity of the executive acquiring his ruined empire. He looked absolutely wretched. The tailored designer suits that he used to wear like armor now hung loosely on his shrinking frame. His expensive haircut was disheveled, and his normally arrogant posture had collapsed into a pathetic hunch. He was sweating profusely despite the heavy air conditioning in the corporate office. He smelled of stale coffee and blind panic. He did not look like the untouchable finance bro who used to laugh at my ambitions at the family dinner table. He looked like a criminal who knew the walls were rapidly closing in and the air was running out. He immediately started rambling, pushing the paperwork across the table and demanding that they expedite the wire transfers so he could make his scheduled flight. His voice was shaking as he tried to maintain his usual arrogant facade while simultaneously begging for the transaction to clear. He started making grand promises about the hidden value in his client portfolios, trying to convince the silent back of my chair that this was the most lucrative deal of the century. He said he just needed the final signatures and the digital authorization codes to hand over full executive control. He pushed his encrypted hard drives across the polished wood. He eagerly explained that those drives contained the master ledgers, the offshore routing numbers, and the untraceable cryptocurrency keys that the government had not found yet. He was offering up the very evidence that would lock him away for decades simply because he believed he was handing it to a corrupt ally who would hide it for him. He slid his navy blue passport right next to the drives, exactly as my legal team had instructed him to do. The trap was set perfectly, and he had willingly locked himself inside without a second thought. He kept talking, his words running together in a frantic, desperate stream. He asked why the buyer was not speaking and demanded to know if there was a problem with the funds. The room was completely silent except for the sound of the rain beating against the glass and the ragged sound of his breathing. I placed my hands on the armrests and slowly, deliberately pushed my feet against the floor. The heavy leather chair rotated smoothly. I swiveled around to face the center of the room, crossing my legs and folding my hands in my lap. The silence that followed was absolute. Trent stopped speaking in the middle of a word. His mouth hung open and his eyes widened to the point where I thought they might physically pop out of his skull. The arrogant, confident golden boy of Atlanta high society completely short-circuited. All the color violently drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. His hands started shaking so violently that he knocked his expensive pen off the table and it clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. He stared at me, unable to comprehend how the sister-in-law he had spent years treating like absolute garbage was now sitting across from him, holding the keys to his survival. He tried to stand up, but his legs completely gave out and he collapsed back into his chair. He stammered my name, his voice barely a terrified whisper. He looked at the lawyers who were standing perfectly still and then back at me. His eyes darted toward the door, measuring his chances of simply running away. But the heavy-set security guards standing outside the glass walls made it clear that leaving was not an option. He looked down at his passport and his encrypted hard drives sitting on the table directly within my reach, and he finally realized the catastrophic magnitude of the trap he had willingly walked into. He tried to backpedal. He started babbling about family loyalty and how we could work this out together. He promised to give me whatever I wanted if I just signed the authorization and let him leave the country. He was literally begging me with tears welling up in his desperate eyes. I sat there and looked at him with nothing but cold, calculating indifference. I felt absolutely zero pity for the man who had stolen millions and destroyed countless lives just to fund his superficial ego. I slowly reached across the polished mahogany table and pulled his passport and his encrypted hard drives toward me. I looked him dead in the eyes and delivered the final crushing blow to his pathetic existence. I did not buy your company to save you, Trent. I bought it to legally seize your passport and hand your hard drives directly to the feds. The next evening was the culmination of Brenda's entire social existence, the annual Atlanta Charity Gala. For 2 decades, my mother had treated this event like her own personal coronation. The grand ballroom of the luxury downtown hotel was decorated with thousands of imported white orchids and cascading crystal chandeliers that cast a warm glow over the most influential people in the state. Brenda was wearing a custom designer gown that cost more than most people's annual salary, and she was floating through the sea of wealthy donors like the undisputed queen of the city. She was completely in her element, surrounding herself with politicians, judges, and old money heiresses, acting as if her life was an absolute triumph. Rumors had already started to circulate through the country club gossip network long before the evening began. Whispers about David's clinic facing unexpected audits and Trent's hedge fund bleeding capital had been quietly passed around over morning mimosas and afternoon tennis matches. But Brenda was a master of delusion and denial. She smiled brightly and clinked her champagne glass with the mayor, spinning a magnificent web of lies to protect her precious social standing. When people asked about my sudden massive wealth, she did not hesitate to step right up and claim the credit. She told everyone in the room that my technology empire was built entirely on family money. She smiled warmly and told the governor that David had provided the seed capital and the vital business connections that made my phenomenal success possible. She was standing in front of the most powerful people in the state, taking credit for the very same ambition she had spent my entire childhood trying to crush. I was not in the ballroom to hear her lies, but I did not need to be. I was watching the entire pathetic performance from the comfort of my penthouse through a live encrypted feed provided by the private security team I had quietly embedded in the catering staff. I watched Brenda work the room completely oblivious to the hurricane that was about to make landfall. Trent and David were seated at the central VIP table right at the front of the ballroom. They did not share Brenda's delusional confidence. Through the high-definition camera feed, I could see the absolute terror radiating from both of them. David was sweating profusely through his expensive tuxedo, his hands shaking every time he reached for his heavy crystal water glass. He knew his medical license was suspended, and he knew the authorities were currently tearing his clinic records apart. Trent looked even worse. He was staring blankly at the floral centerpiece, looking like a dead man whose body just had not realized it yet. He knew his passport was in federal custody, and he knew I had handed his encrypted hard drives directly to the authorities the day before. They were sitting in a room full of billionaires trying to project power and prestige, while their entire world was literally burning to ash beneath their feet. The dinner service had just concluded, and Brenda confidently walked up to the grand podium to deliver her keynote address. She tapped the microphone with her manicured nails to demand the attention of the 500 elite guests. She started talking about family values and the importance of charitable giving, her voice echoing through the massive room with sickening sincerity. She was right in the middle of a sentence about the importance of legacy and integrity when the heavy brass doors at the back of the ballroom suddenly swung open. It was not the venue's staff bringing out the dessert course. It was a fully armed tactical unit. Over 24 federal agents stepped into the ballroom wearing dark tactical gear with the letters FBI printed in bold yellow across their heavy vests. The string quartet in the corner abruptly stopped playing, leaving a jarring, discordant silence in the air. 500 of Atlanta's wealthiest and most influential citizens froze in absolute shock. The clinking of silverware stopped. The whispered conversations died instantly. The only sound in the massive room was the heavy synchronized thud of tactical boots marching across the polished hardwood floor. The lead agent did not even glance at Brenda standing frozen at the podium. The team marched in a perfect straight line, cutting directly through the sea of silk gowns and tailored tuxedos. They walked right past the mayor's table and the governor's table, moving with a cold, terrifying purpose directly toward the central VIP table. Trent did not even try to run or pretend he was innocent. He knew it was over. As the federal agents surrounded the table, he simply placed his hands flat on the white tablecloth and bowed his head in total defeat. The lead agent projected his voice across the silent ballroom, announcing that Trent was being placed under federal arrest for massive wire fraud and multi-million-dollar embezzlement. The heavy metallic click of the handcuffs locking around Trent's wrists echoed through the room like a gunshot. The golden boy of the family, the man who was supposed to be the brilliant financial savior, was yanked to his feet and patted down for weapons in front of the entire country club elite. David reacted differently. His narcissism and his absolute belief in his own superiority made him think he could talk his way out of a federal raid. He stood up quickly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He puffed out his chest and tried to use his authoritative doctor voice. He pointed his finger at the lead agent and loudly demanded that they unhand his son-in-law immediately. He tried to tell the federal authorities that they were making a terrible mistake and that he was a highly respected medical professional who played golf with the district attorney. The agents did not care about his golf partners. A second team of tactical officers moved in and grabbed David's arms, twisting them firmly behind his back. The agent announced in a loud, booming voice that David was being placed under arrest for felony accessory to money laundering and conspiracy to commit financial fraud. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. The wealthy socialites covered their mouths in shock as they watched the prestigious doctor, the patriarch of the proud family, forcefully shoved against the table and handcuffed like a common street criminal. David started stammering and begging, looking around the room for anyone to intervene, but his wealthy friends just stared at him with horror and absolute disgust. The agents formed a perimeter and began frog-marching Trent and David down the center aisle toward the exit. They paraded them right past the tables of investors they had stolen from and the country club rivals they had looked down on for years. Their expensive suits were wrinkled, and their dignity was completely eradicated as they were dragged out of the building. I watched the screen as the camera zoomed in on Brenda. She was still standing at the podium, gripping the edges of the wood so tightly her knuckles were completely white. The microphone was still on, broadcasting her ragged, panicked breathing to the entire silent ballroom. She had spent her entire life destroying her daughters and protecting a toxic illusion just so she could maintain her status in this exact room. Now she was standing there, humiliated beyond repair, stripped of her power, and forced to watch her fake empire publicly crumble into dust in front of the very society she had sacrificed her own children to impress. The absolute silence of my penthouse was a stark contrast to the absolute chaos consuming the rest of my family. Within 24 hours of the FBI raid, Trent and David had been processed, booked, and stripped of their custom-tailored suits. They were now sitting in federal holding cells wearing cheap orange jumpsuits, waiting for bail hearings that would never come because every single one of their accounts had been frozen by the government. The grand illusion was dead, and the harsh reality of federal prison was setting in. But while the men were locked away in concrete cells, the true psychological destruction was happening back at the family estate. The bank had already initiated the foreclosure process on my parents' sprawling mansion. The luxury cars had been towed away from the circular driveway, and the expensive artwork had been seized by creditors. Brenda and Sydney were left standing alone in the massive empty house, with nothing but the echoing silence of their ruined lives. For my entire life, I had watched those two women operate as an inseparable team. Brenda was the architect of the family delusion, and Sydney was her perfect golden masterpiece. They had spent decades validating each other's toxic behavior and looking down on everyone else. But the foundation of their relationship was built entirely on money and status, and with both of those things completely gone, there was nothing left to hold them together. I knew exactly what was happening, because the house manager, who was still waiting on 3 weeks of unpaid wages, happily gave me a full report of the fallout. He told me that Brenda started pacing the empty marble foyer like a trapped animal. She could not process the fact that she was no longer a wealthy socialite. She needed a scapegoat. She needed someone to blame for the catastrophic destruction of her reputation. And since I was completely out of her reach, she turned her vicious sights on the only person left in the room. Brenda looked at her precious golden child and unleashed decades of suppressed venom. She started screaming at Sydney, blaming her for Trent's desperate financial crimes. She told Sydney that if she had just been a better wife, Trent would not have felt the need to act so erratically. Brenda actually had the audacity to claim that Sydney's constant need for expensive handbags and luxury vacations had driven her husband to embezzle millions. She looked her weeping daughter in the eye and told her that she had failed to keep her husband satisfied at home, and that was why he had sought validation and comfort in the arms of other women and in the thrill of illegal investments. She blamed the entire collapse of the family empire on Sydney's inability to be the perfect submissive wife. For 30 years, Sydney had smiled and nodded and played the role of the perfect obedient daughter. She had accepted my mother's toxic coaching and participated in my emotional abuse just to keep her spot on the pedestal. But being blamed for her husband's federal indictments and his blatant infidelity was the final breaking point. Sydney finally snapped. The golden child shattered into a million jagged pieces right there in the empty foyer. She screamed back at Brenda with a ferocity that shook the remaining crystal chandeliers. She threw her wedding ring across the marble floor and told our mother that she was a pathetic, delusional enabler who had sold her own daughters to the highest bidders just to maintain her country club memberships. Sydney cried out that she had spent her entire life starving herself, modifying her body and shrinking her personality just to fit into the impossible mold Brenda had created. She pointed out that it was Brenda who had pushed her to marry Trent in the first place, ignoring all the red flags simply because he drove a sports car and wore a Rolex. They stood in the middle of the foreclosed mansion tearing each other to absolute shreds. They ripped away decades of polite society manners and exposed the rotting core of their relationship. There was no love between them. There was only mutual resentment and the bitter realization that they had destroyed their own lives for an audience of fake friends who had already abandoned them. The house manager said the screaming match lasted for hours, until Sydney finally grabbed her coat and walked out the front door, leaving our mother completely alone in the echoing dark house. Brenda had finally alienated the last person on earth who was willing to tolerate her. Her husband was facing decades in federal prison. Her favorite son-in-law was looking at a massive fraud conviction, and her perfect daughter had just abandoned her. She had absolutely no money, no friends, and no social standing. She was completely and utterly isolated. That was when my phone lit up. I was sitting on my balcony watching the city skyline when a call came through from Brenda's number. I did not answer it. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. I sat there for a few minutes, letting the cool night air wash over me before I finally tapped the screen to listen to the message. It was a masterpiece of absolute desperation. The woman who had spent my entire life telling me I was a worthless disappointment was now sobbing hysterically into the receiver. Her voice was ragged and choked with panic. She completely abandoned her usual haughty tone and was practically choking on her own tears. She begged me to answer the phone. She said she needed me more than she had ever needed anyone in her entire life. She started pleading for money, telling me that David and Trent needed high-powered federal defense attorneys and that the retainers were going to cost millions of dollars. She tried to play the family card, crying about how we needed to stick together in times of crisis, and how she always knew I was the smart one who would save them all. She actually used the word save. She begged her discarded scapegoat to open up my checkbook and rescue the very people who had actively tried to destroy my sanity. She went on, her voice growing more shrill and frantic with every word. She promised that things would be different now and that we could be a real family again if I just wired the funds to her new legal team. She was willing to say anything to get her hands on my money. I sat there listening to the sound of my mother begging for her life. For years, I had waited for the moment when the power dynamic would finally shift. I used to lie awake at night wondering what it would feel like to have them come crawling to me for help. I thought I would feel vindicated or triumphant, or maybe even a little bit sad. But as I listened to her pathetic sobbing, I realized I felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger left in my heart, and there was certainly no pity. There was just a profound, quiet emptiness where my family used to be. I did not even wait for her to finish her desperate rambling. right in the middle of her pleading for a multi-million-dollar wire transfer. I simply pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the delete button. The audio cut out instantly, leaving me in total silence. I blocked her number, blocked Sydney's number, and blocked every single remaining contact from my past life. I set my phone down on the table and looked out at the glowing city below. The blame game was over, and I had officially removed myself from the board. The morning sun brought a brutal new reality for what remained of my family. My legal team had not wasted a single second after the federal authorities cleared the ballroom. Because my family had spent years fraudulently using my identity and forging my signature to secure massive lines of credit for their lavish lifestyle, I had every legal right to claw back what was mine. My lead attorney filed the emergency injunctions the moment the civil courts opened. We did not just freeze their assets, we initiated a total and aggressive liquidation to pay off the debts they had secretly accrued in my name. I did not have to be physically present at the estate to see it happen, but my private security contractors provided a very thorough and satisfying report. A fleet of heavy industrial tow trucks arrived at the wrought iron gates of the family mansion, just as the morning dew was drying on the manicured lawns. Brenda was still inside, pacing the empty marble halls and spiraling into a deep panic when the repo men marched up the driveway with court orders in hand. They did not care about her frantic screaming or her shrill threats to call the police. They bypassed her completely and went straight for the garage. They hitched up the pristine silver Mercedes my father loved to flaunt at the golf course, and they dragged out the obnoxious imported sports car Trent had bought with stolen charity funds. Brenda stood on the grand portico in her silk robe, shrieking like a banshee, as the ultimate symbols of her manufactured wealth were hauled down the driveway and repossessed. The house manager, whom I had already quietly put on my own payroll, seamlessly guided the liquidators through the house, pointing out the expensive imported artwork and the designer furniture that had been purchased with fraudulent credit. They stripped the house down to its bare bones while my mother watched in sheer, helpless horror. But Brenda could not handle the isolation of the empty, foreclosed mansion. Her mind simply rejected the reality of her sudden poverty. She needed a distraction, and she needed an audience to validate her existence. She put on her finest remaining day dress, layered her face with expensive makeup to hide her swollen red eyes, and drove her last remaining leased vehicle straight to the elite Buckhead Country Club. She genuinely thought she could just walk into the dining room, order an expensive mimosa, and pretend the FBI raid the night before was just a grotesque misunderstanding. She was completely delusional. She did not realize that the news of her charity embezzlement and David's arrest had already plastered the morning society blogs and local news channels. The women she had played tennis with, the women she had gossiped with and judged for decades, had already convened an emergency meeting with the club board of directors. When Brenda walked through the heavy glass doors of the lobby, she was not greeted by the usual bowing staff or the warm smiles of the concierge. The club manager stood directly in her path, blocking her from entering the dining room, where all her former friends were sitting in dead silence watching the spectacle unfold. He held a formal letter of expulsion printed on expensive heavy cardstock. He informed her in a loud, clear voice that her membership was permanently revoked effective immediately due to the criminal nature of her financial affairs and the absolute shame she had brought upon their charitable organizations. He did not even give her the chance to argue or defend herself. He simply signaled the club's security, who flanked her on both sides, and publicly escorted the former Queen of Atlanta society right out the front doors. She was turned away at the gates, humiliated in front of the exact same women she had destroyed my sister and me to impress. She was officially an outcast in her own kingdom, with no husband to fund her, no daughter to bully, and no society to worship her. Brenda had literally nowhere left to go. Her bank cards were declining, her phone was silent, and the walls of her empty house were echoing with the ghosts of her own arrogance. She was finally forced to face the one person she had spent her entire life underestimating: me. She knew I had blocked her number and severed all digital ties, so she resorted to the pathetic tactics of a desperate stalker. It was late Tuesday evening and a heavy, cold rain was washing the city streets. I was leaving my private corporate building, stepping out from the secure lobby toward my waiting black car. My personal security detail was walking just ahead of me, holding a large black umbrella to shield me from the freezing downpour. As I approached the vehicle, a figure stepped out from the deep shadows near the concrete pillars of the parking garage. It was Brenda. She had been waiting outside in the freezing rain for hours, knowing that my security team would never let her pass the front desk. She looked absolutely pathetic. Her perfectly styled blonde hair was plastered to her skull by the rain, and her expensive designer coat was soaked through and clinging to her shivering frame. The heavy mascara was running down her cheeks in dark, jagged lines, making her look like a hollowed-out ghost of the formidable woman she used to be. She bypassed my security guards, attempting to rush toward me, but they immediately stepped into her path, blocking her with their broad shoulders. She stood there in the pouring rain, trembling violently, and looked at me with eyes full of a frantic, manipulative desperation. She did not apologize for the massive fraud. She did not apologize for treating me like garbage my entire life, or for actively trying to ruin my future to protect her own status. Instead, she reached deep into her toxic psychological playbook and pulled out the oldest emotional weapon a narcissistic mother possesses. She stared at me through the rain and her voice cracked as she wailed that she carried me for 9 months. She actually thought that basic biological fact was a magic phrase that would instantly erase decades of psychological abuse and force me to hand over my fortune to save her. She thought I still carried that primal childlike guilt that kept Sydney trapped for so long. I stopped walking and looked at her shivering in the cold. I did not feel an ounce of sympathy. I just felt tired of her endless pathetic games. The contrast between my warm, secure reality and her cold, wet desperation was not a tragedy, it was simply the consequence of her own actions. I looked her dead in the eyes, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "And I carried your financial illiteracy for 10 years, I said smoothly. "We are even." I did not wait for her to process the words. I simply gave a sharp nod to my security chief and stepped into the warm, dry interior of my car. As the driver pulled away from the curb, I looked out the tinted window and watched the guards firmly escort my mother off the premises, leaving her to stand completely alone in the cold, unforgiving rain. 6 months passed since that night in the freezing rain. The relentless media circus finally packed up their cameras and moved on to the next scandal, leaving the shattered remains of my family to face the absolute reality of their new lives. The dust had finally settled, and the contrast between the world they used to rule and the world they were forced to inhabit was nothing short of poetic justice. Trent was no longer the arrogant golden boy of the financial district. He was currently sitting in a maximum security federal penitentiary, serving a mandatory 12-year sentence for wire fraud and embezzlement. There were no more expensive Scotch tastings or private charter flights to tropical islands. His entire existence was now reduced to a heavily scheduled routine dictated by prison guards and steel doors. He had traded his custom-tailored designer suits for a scratchy orange jumpsuit with a federal inmate number stamped across the back. My lead investigator occasionally sent me updates letting me know that Trent spent most of his days staring at the concrete walls of his cell, completely broken by the reality that his charm and his manipulation could not buy his way out of a federal cage. David had fallen just as hard. The state medical board stripped him of his medical license with absolute prejudice, ensuring he could never practice as a physician again. The man who used to strut through the halls of his luxury private clinic acting like a god among men was now working as a disgraced administrative consultant in a rundown low-income medical facility on the outskirts of the city. His massive ego had been completely crushed. He was forced to spend his days filing paperwork and answering to junior clinic managers who treated him with the exact same condescending disrespect he used to inflict on his own staff. There were no more country club golf tournaments, and no more expensive steak dinners with the mayor. He was just a tired old man drowning in legal debt and public disgrace. Brenda was perhaps the most pathetic of them all. The sprawling estate with the marble foyer and the crystal chandeliers was long gone sold at a public auction to pay off a fraction of their massive debts. She was now living in a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood she used to aggressively mock. There were no house managers, no personal chefs, and no society friends coming over for morning mimosas. Her phone never rang because every single person she had spent her life trying to impress had blocked her number the second the FBI raided the charity gala. She spent her days sitting on a cheap sofa in her tiny living room, staring at old scrapbooks and desperately clinging to the fading memories of a fake empire that never really belonged to her in the first place. But the most fascinating transformation belonged to Sydney. For her entire life, my sister had functioned as a beautiful, expensive ornament. She had never worked a day in her life, and she had never faced a single consequence for her toxic behavior. But with her husband in federal prison and her parents completely bankrupt, Sydney was suddenly forced to do the one thing she considered to be the ultimate humiliation. She had to get a job. She managed to secure a retail position at an exclusive luxury boutique in the high-end shopping district downtown. It was the exact same boutique where she used to spend thousands of dollars of Trent's stolen money on a regular Tuesday afternoon. Now, instead of walking through the doors as a pampered VIP client, she was standing behind the cash register wearing a black uniform and a cheap plastic name tag. She was forced to steam clothes, fold sweaters, and fetch different shoe sizes for the exact same wealthy socialites she used to party with. It was a daily, grueling exercise in public humiliation, and she had absolutely no choice but to smile and endure it just to pay her rent. I knew she worked there, but I had never made an effort to go see her. I was far too busy expanding my technology company and enjoying the peaceful, drama-free life I had built for myself. But one crisp Tuesday afternoon, I happened to be walking through the downtown shopping district after a highly successful lunch meeting with my investors. The air was cool and the sky was a brilliant clear blue. I walked past the grand glass windows of the luxury boutique, and without really planning it, I decided to step inside. The bell above the door chimed softly as I walked onto the plush carpet. The store was quiet and smelled of expensive perfume and fresh leather. I walked slowly past the displays of designer handbags and silk blouses, and then I saw her. Sydney was standing near the back of the store organizing a display of cashmere scarves. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a severe tight ponytail and she looked exhausted. The moment the door chimed, she looked up with her standard retail smile, completely ready to greet the incoming customer. Our eyes locked across the quiet store. I saw her entire body go completely stiff. The fake smile vanished from her face, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. Her hands started to shake so badly, she dropped one of the expensive scarves onto the floor. She stared at me, bracing herself for the impact. She knew exactly how much power I had, and she knew exactly how much she had tortured me when we were growing up. She was standing there frozen, expecting me to march up to her and unleash a torrent of verbal abuse. She expected me to mock her cheap uniform, to laugh at her ruined life, and to publicly humiliate her in front of her store manager. She expected the grand dramatic revenge that Brenda would have executed if the roles were reversed. But I did not do any of that. I simply broke eye contact and continued walking through the store. I casually browsed the racks, running my fingers over the soft fabrics, completely ignoring her frantic, anxious energy. I picked up a beautiful, simple gray silk scarf that caught my eye. I checked the price tag, and then I walked directly over to the cash register where Sydney was standing. She looked like she was going to be sick. Her breathing was shallow and erratic, and she could not bring herself to look me in the eyes. She stood behind the polished counter, waiting for the verbal blow that she was so certain was coming. I placed the silk scarf gently on the counter and slid my black credit card right next to it. I looked at her with a calm, smooth, and perfectly polite expression. "I would like to purchase this, please," I said softly, my voice completely void of any emotion. Sydney flinched at the sound of my voice, but she quickly realized I was not attacking her. She clumsily grabbed the scanner and rang up the scarf. her hands trembling as she processed the transaction. She swiped my card and placed the scarf into a thick, glossy shopping bag. She slid the bag across the counter toward me, her eyes still fixed firmly on the register screen. "Thank you," I said politely, taking the bag in my hand. "I hope you have a wonderful afternoon." She finally looked up at me, her eyes wide with total disbelief. There was no anger in my face, no petty triumph, and absolutely no gloating. I was treating her exactly like a complete stranger. I was treating her like an anonymous retail worker who meant absolutely nothing to me. And in that brief, silent moment, I watched the devastating realization wash over her face. She finally understood that she did not even matter enough for me to hate her anymore. I turned around and walked out the glass doors, stepping back into the bright, warm sunlight. I did not look back. True indifference was the ultimate closure, and for the first time in my life, I was truly, completely free. The massive downtown convention center was buzzing with a vibrant electric energy that I could actually feel vibrating through the floorboards beneath my feet. I stood quietly behind the heavy velvet curtains of the main stage, listening to the low, steady roar of thousands of people finding their seats in the grand auditorium. This was not an arrogant country club gala filled with desperate socialites trying to impress each other with stolen wealth and superficial titles. This was the official launch of the Lumiere Foundation, and the atmosphere was thick with genuine anticipation and absolute respect. I had taken $50 million of my own liquid corporate capital and spent the last 6 months building a massive incubator program from scratch. The foundation was specifically designed to fund, empower, and support independent Black female founders breaking into the technology and global logistics sectors. I wanted to create an impenetrable safety net and a powerful launching pad for brilliant women who were constantly overlooked and underestimated by the traditional financial establishment. I was using my immense wealth to build the exact room I had always been excluded from when I was younger, and I was intentionally filling it with visionary people who were valued entirely for their minds and their unyielding ambition. My mother had spent her entire life using fake charity events to steal from the vulnerable just to fund her pathetic illusion of grandeur. I was doing the exact opposite. I was giving away my own money to create lasting generational power and to permanently alter the landscape of the industry. I was not standing in the shadows backstage alone. I looked to my left and saw Valerie, my powerhouse lead attorney, leaning against a production crate reviewing the final legal structures for our massive grant distributions. She was wearing a sharp tailored suit, and she looked up from her digital tablet to give me a look of absolute fiercely earned pride. Standing right next to her was my entire executive board, the brilliant, loyal men and women who had stood firmly by my side during the darkest days of the hostile takeovers and the endless, sleepless nights of building the empire. They were laughing softly and sharing last-minute notes, passing around devices, and making sure every single detail of the presentation was flawless. I looked at them and felt an overwhelming wave of profound gratitude wash over my spirit. This was my chosen family. In this circle there was no toxic competition, no subtle manipulation, and absolutely no conditional love based on obedience. I was finally surrounded by a dedicated community of peers who respected me for my intellect, my resilience, and my character, instead of my utility or my willingness to stay small. I had spent 3 decades starving for validation from people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it, and now my life was overflowing with genuine connection. The stage manager approached our group and quietly let me know that we were exactly 2 minutes away from the opening introduction. I nodded, thanking him, and reached into the deep pocket of my custom designer suit to silence my mobile device before walking out into the lights. As I pulled the phone out, the bright screen lit up my palm with a single new email notification. The sender name was Brenda. It was a completely unprompted message sent directly to my private professional address, bypassing all of my usual security filters. There was no subject line, and there was no long-winded manipulative preamble attempting to rewrite our toxic history. The body of the email contained exactly 3 words: "We have nothing, I stood perfectly still in the dim backstage lighting and stared at the glowing screen for several long seconds, letting the absolute finality of those three simple words wash over me. A year ago, a desperate message like that from my mother would have sent me into an immediate spiral of heavy guilt and frantic problem solving. I would have drained my accounts to rescue her from the consequences of her own terrible choices, and I would have allowed her to continue draining my soul in return. But now, looking at that pathetic late-night plea for mercy, I felt completely free. She was right. She did have nothing. But what Brenda considered nothing was incredibly revealing. She still had a husband, but because his medical license was revoked and his ego was crushed, he was useless to her. She still had her golden child daughter, but because Sydney was working retail and could no longer afford luxury items, she was also useless to her. To Brenda, love and family did not exist without money and status. Without her country club membership and her stolen designer gowns, she genuinely believed her life was empty. They had spent their entire lives trying to convince me that I was the worthless failure who would end up completely isolated and alone. But the brutal truth of their absolute failure was finally written right there on my screen. I did not type a response. I did not feel the need to send a triumphant reply or remind her that she brought this total devastation upon herself. I calmly pressed the lock button on the side of the device, watching the bright screen instantly fade to black. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, leaving her miserable message permanently unanswered in the dark. I heard the announcer project my name across the massive sound system, welcoming Rochelle to the stage. The heavy velvet curtains smoothly pulled back to reveal the blinding stage lights and a sea of eager faces. A deafening roar of genuine supportive applause erupted from the thousands of brilliant women sitting in the packed auditorium. They were standing on their feet, cheering for the future we were about to build together. I took a deep cleansing breath and stepped up to the microphone, standing tall, confident, and entirely unbroken. I had built my magnificent empire from the hard ground up, and they had willfully burned theirs to ash. The past was gone forever, and the future was entirely mine. The ultimate lesson from this story is that your true worth is never defined by the people who consistently underestimate you. Blood does not automatically equal family, and loyalty should never be demanded at the expense of your own mental health and success. When toxic relatives attempt to diminish your light, the most powerful revenge is not anger or retaliation, but achieving massive success and absolute indifference. You must securely build your own table instead of begging for a seat at theirs. Share your own experiences about walking away from toxicity in the comments and subscribe for more empowering stories.